this the most ultimate of ultimate crosscut sleds? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. I took the features of all of my favorite ultimate crosscut sleds that I found on YouTube and crammed them into this thing, and I added one feature myself. Let me show you what it does. It has extendable fences on both sides. Just undo my thumb screws and extend my fence. I can get a little over 30 inches on my left side, and on my right side, I can get about 40 inches. I have my Cat's Moses stop block that I can use anywhere up and along the length of this fence. I have multiple T-tracks in here to hold down all my work pieces. All I have to do is take my hold down clamps, slide them in my T-track and put it in. That works great for small pieces where I don't want to get my hands too close to the blade. It has a removable back fence so that if I end up with a piece that's a little wider than my crosscut sled, I can remove the back fence and make the cut I need. It also has an adjustable kerf in it. I can take these kerfs and I can slide them in and out for either a 45 cut or a dado cut. And that allows me to be more flexible with my cuts on this without tearing up my sled. I have an interchangeable kerf insert on the fence. That's where I can do 45s or I can do dados. I've played around with a box joint jig, 3/4 inch dado, 1/2 inch dado. Stick around for the end. I've got another jig that attaches to this that I'll show you at the end of the video. I have links for the plans, the tools, and all the hardware that I used in this down in the description, so go check that out. Now let me show you how I made it. The evening I started this project, I was limited on time, so I decided I was just gonna get my material broke down. I thought it'd be a good idea to cut my laminate at the same time I was cutting my plywood, and that worked out pretty good, except this saw doesn't cut straight. But this one does. I cut out the base for my crosscut sled, and then the two pieces I was going to need for my front fence. Once I completed that, I was out of time for that day. On to the next. The plan yesterday was to get all of my cuts made and the grooves inside my fence for my extensions, to cut little dados in here, but FedEx has failed me. I'm still waiting on my aluminum tubing. It was supposed to be here yesterday. FedEx says it'll be here by about 1:50 today. So we'll see if that happens or not, but don't trust FedEx when you've got a schedule to keep. Today I'm gonna go ahead and work on the back fence, get that cut out, and get the laminate on the tops and the bottom of the main board, and work on just the main part of the sled, and leave my fence for later when those do show up, if FedEx ever does get here. So I hop back on the table saw and cut out the two pieces I'm going to need for my back fence. And yes, those are pretty small pieces, and I'll show you why later in the video. I move over to my workbench and apply an ample amount of glue to one of the sides, spread it out with my God-given glue spreaders, clamp them together against this 4-foot level I'm using as a straight edge. I saw this trick on 3x3 Customs and 731 Woodworks. Setting that aside to dry, it's time to break down some laminate. The best way to break down your laminate is to use a scoring knife against a straight edge. You simply drag your scoring knife along the straight edge, bearing down into the laminate. This will cause a groove. Then you come and you push the laminate back over itself and pop! There you go. You should have a nice straight edge. Here's an up close shot of it. On these smaller pieces, you do have to work it down a little bit. The whole line isn't gonna break at the same time. Now I had a lot of pieces to cut, and I'm not gonna bore you with that because I figured you don't wanna watch me do that for 30 minutes. I'm gonna jump ahead to applying the laminate to my sled base. To do that, I'm going to use contact cement and put a good coat on the bottom of the laminate and set it aside to dry. Now, should I be wearing a respirator? Probably. But I am in a well-ventilated space. You can see the fan behind me. It is a beautiful spring day here in Texas while I'm filming this, and I have the garage open, and you can see it's nice and windy out there. I'm in a well-ventilated space, but this stuff is stout if you're not. So while it's drying on the laminate bottom, I come back and apply contact cement to the plywood and let that dry as well. It is 12:30, the day after FedEx was supposed to deliver my aluminum tubing for my fence, and it's still not here. Now, according to the app, they're supposed to be here sometime between 9:30 this morning and 1:50 this afternoon. It'll probably be 8 o'clock tonight when they show up, so this might delay this project a little bit. We'll see. After about a 20-minute break, I came back to check on my contact cement and it had dried, so it's time to apply it. As you can see, I'm using some separators here. These are just random sticks I had laying around. You can use dowels or just pretty much anything you have, because you want to be able to lay it down evenly. You start in the middle, you press it down and work your way to the outside edges, removing your spacers as you go. And you got to make sure you don't have anything under there, because it will bubble up on you. After getting that applied, you'll want to come back with a roller and apply a lot of pressure to make sure the contact cement takes hold. With that side done, it's time to flip it over and repeat the process on the other side of applying cement to the bottom of the laminate and then to the plywood. And while I'm finishing that up, I get a visitor. Oh my goodness, look who it is. They showed up. They're here, finally. Since I had some laminate and plywood with contact cement that was now dried, I needed to go ahead and take care of that before I could open my package. I'd have lost that bet. FedEx did show up at about 1 o'clock. Let's see what they brought me. There we go. Half-inch aluminum tubing. That's going to go on the inside of my fence and allow me to extend the sides. Sweet. Let's get to it. I waited until I got my aluminum tubing to cut these grooves because I wanted a really tight fit. I know they were supposed to be 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, but sometimes things have variances and I didn't want to set up a 1/2 inch dado and end up being a little too big and causing my fence to have a lot of slack. Now that I have those grooves cut, I'm going to place the aluminum tubing inside of it and then place the other piece of the fence on top, making sure that everything fits nice and tightly, but that the aluminum still can move in and out of the fence. Check that out. To smooth these grooves out, I go ahead and do a light sanding pass and then add a little bit of paste wax. This should make things slide nicely. Once that paste wax dries, it's time to glue the fence up. I use blue tape to cover the grooves, and this prevents the glue from getting into those grooves as I spread it out. After I get done spreading it out, I'll just simply grab that blue tape, pull it out, place the tubes inside of the grooves, and place the other side of the fence over them. So I thought this would be a cool angle to film from, and it would have been if my big noggin wasn't in the way. Sorry about that. Anyway, I take that fence and clamp it to the 4-foot level I used earlier for the back fence and set it aside for the glue to dry. Grabbing my router and using a flush trim bit, I trim off all of the excess laminate on my sled base. So I thought I was gonna get to show y'all me applying laminate to all of the edges, but this shot of me putting the contact cement on this edge was all that I remembered to record. So as you can see, I applied laminate to all the edges. Then I grabbed a chamfer bit and put it in my router and routed a chamfer around the whole thing. Now I get to test out the marker board feature. Yay! Truthfully, I don't know if this is gonna be a useful feature or not, but hey, why not? To attach my runners to my sled base, I'm going to use double-sided tape. All I had was this wide stuff, so I laid it across both runners and trimmed it down to size. Here you see me placing washers inside of my miter slots, and you ask, why are you doing that? Because when I place these runners inside the miter slots, it will cause them to sit high enough that the tape will stick to the bottom of the sled base. With those in place, I will take my sled base and line it up against my fence, then push it down on top of the runners, sticking them to my sled. I know this tape isn't going to be good enough to permanently adhere these runners to the sled base, so I'm going to need to use screws as well. Using a bit with a countersink, I pre-drill my screw holes and then I start inserting my screws. It's important to not over tighten the screws because this HDPE will bulge and it will cause the runners to not slide. As you can see here, I have no wiggle, but it also is a little difficult to slide because I did over tighten those. Anyway, I'll cut off the excess with my flush trim saw and then come back and slightly untighten the screws so that it will slide correctly. That's better. And to make sure it slides nicely, I added a nice little coat of paste wax. Since I already had it out, I went ahead and reapplied to my tabletop too. Let's check on the front fence. The glue's all dried up and the aluminum tubing is coming out without any problems. It's kind of nice when things go as planned. Back to applying laminate. Yes, I'm laminating pretty much this whole thing, and I'm using that same process. Put the contact cement on both pieces, let it dry, attach it, and push it down with a roller. Trim everything flush with the flush trim bit, attach the rest of the pieces, and give everything a slight chamfer. To make the sliding ends, I'm going to cut 3 inches off of each end of the fence, and then we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, I'm going to make my kerf cut in my sled base. I'm going to be careful here not to cut all the way through it. I want to leave about 2 inches on either end. This kerf is just for reference for cuts later in the build. I'm attaching multi-track to the front of my fence using T-bolts. So I carefully mark where I want the T-bolts to go through my fence, making sure not to cut through my tubing channels. Then I'll take a Forstner bit and I'll cut in a recess for the nut that's going to go in the bolt. Then I'm going to come back with a 1/4 inch drill bit and drill the hole the rest of the way through. All right, let's insert the T-bolts and slide on the multi-track and hope I got everything lined up correctly. It looks like I did, but other mistakes were made. Do you see it? Yeah. That right there is going to be in the way of my dado blade when I need to make a dado cut. What happened is I put the recess for the nuts on the wrong side of the fence, because the fence should be turned this way. You can see now I don't have any bolts that are going to get in the way. Let's see how I fix this. I mean, it's just simply drilling a hole with the Forstner bit on the other side, right? Well, I already have a 1/4 inch hole there, and that will give the Forstner bit a 1/4 inch to dance around in, which I promise you will make a lopsided hole. So I made a hole through a sacrificial board to use as a guide. I lined it up by dropping a washer in and lining the holes up, clamping everything into place, removing the washer, then boring my recesses. Now that my holes are on the correct side of the fence, it's time to start working on the slide feature. I'm drilling some recesses for threaded inserts, and then using a regular drill bit, I'm going to drill into the tubing channels. I only want to drill halfway through the fence here. I'm not going all the way through, and I'll show you why in just a moment as I insert these threaded inserts. I'm going to place the aluminum tubing back inside the fence, then take the end piece and place it on the aluminum tubing. I have some headless bolts that I'm going to insert through the threaded inserts and tighten them down onto the aluminum tubing. I'm not going through the tubing with these. They're just putting pressure on the tubing and locking it into place against the other side of the fence. Then it should slide in and out like so. To keep it from sliding out when I don't want it to, I've got some thumb screws. And then I can use those thumb screws to lock it in place when it's in the extended position. Now I get to take it all back out. Why, you might ask? Well, I'm going to lock the threaded inserts in with some 5-minute epoxy. They say 5-minute epoxy, you better be working fast if you're going to try to do all this in 5 minutes. This epoxy was hardening a little bit quicker than 5 minutes, so I was having to do smaller portions. But you just put a little epoxy on them and screw them back in. Oh yeah, router time. And I get to break in my new CMT 3/4 inch straight bit. And check out that router sled that I threw together out of some scrap plywood. After my first pass, I make a quick check to make sure my depth and everything looks okay. And then I get to routing out the area for my adjustable kerfs. This was a pretty big area to route out, and there's no way I would have been able to route this without having the router sled. It made short work of it, and a whole lot of sawdust. Now I move on to making the grooves for my T-track. One of the tricks I use to set the depth on my router is I will place it on top of the material that I am insetting. In this case, it's the T-track. Plunge it down to a solid surface, set my depth. Now my depth of my router will match the material to be inset, making perfect grooves. The reason I chose this router bit is because it is the same size as my T-track, so as you can see, these things fit perfectly with just using this one bit instead of having to make multiple passes. I finish my 4 cuts for my T-track and start cutting down the T-track to size. Since my Crosscut Sled isn't functioning yet, I have to use my miter gauge. That's starting to look nice. Using a self-centering bit, I pre-drill all of the screw holes for the T-track. I'll come back to the T-track later. I want to go ahead and start pre-drilling the holes for the threaded inserts that will hold my adjustable kerfs in place. Now I do wish that I would have used a Forstner bit on this part here instead of a wood bit, because that wood bit walked on me a little bit and it did cause a little bit of misalignment. But hey, experience is the best teacher. Once again, I go ahead and insert the threaded inserts temporarily, come back with some 5-minute epoxy, working one at a time, put a little epoxy on those inserts and screw them in place. The reason I didn't screw the T-track in earlier is because I knew the screws would be inadequate to hold the T-track down permanently. I wanted to wait and do all of my epoxy work at the same time. So now I'm going to take epoxy, place it on the T-track, and secure it with the screws until the epoxy dries. Back to working on the back fence, because I decided to get a little fancy with this one. Using my tenon jig, there's another video on my channel for this jig, I make a couple of straight cuts. Then I'm gonna make some 45s to cut those little pieces off that you can see. Reason for this is I needed a little bit of shorter side to put T-bolts through so I can attach it to the T-tracks. Then I'm gonna cut a rabbet that's 1 inch wide on the bottom and create the holes for the T-bolts to go through. Voila. I decided before putting the sled back on the table, it would be a good idea to cut down the inserts for the adjustable kerfs. With that done, I put the sled back on the table and attach my fence. I'm going to use these star knobs with some T-bolts, and that will make my fence easy to remove. Placing one of my adjustable kerf insets in the adjustable kerf area, I'm going to start working on getting my front fence set. I want it to have a 1/4 inch offset, just for aesthetics, I guess. So I clamp it in place there and use a square to square it up the best possible and tighten down my clamps. Now I need to put 2 screws into it before I start my 5-cut method. So I measure the depth of my fence in order to make sure I'm not driving a screw into the aluminum tubing. I mark the place on the sled and start pre-drilling with my countersink bit. Did you catch my mistake? Because at this point, I hadn't. Just wondering why my drill bit wasn't working correctly. But when my drill bit got stuck, I realized something was off. Figure it out yet? Well, I'll show you. When I measured the depth of my fence, I didn't take into account the 1/4 inch offset. Whoops. Accounting for the offset this time, I marked where I needed to drill the hole, and drilled the hole without any issues this time. So then I inserted a nice long 3-inch screw and went to the other side of the fence and did the same thing. Well, not the exact same thing. I accounted for the 1/4 inch offset this time. And hey, if you would prefer to learn from my mistakes instead of yours, hit that subscribe button down below. After attaching my multi-track, it's time to get this thing squared up. And it's already pretty close to square. But we're gonna get closer by using the 5-cut method. For the 5-cut method, you're gonna mark an A and a B at the top and bottom of the left side of the board. You'll do 1, 2, 3, 4 in a clockwise motion around the board, and then you will shave off a piece of each one of those sides. The reason for doing this is each cut you make exaggerates the variation a little bit more, and you can take that number at the end and place it in a complex math equation to figure out how much you need to adjust your fence. King's Fine Woodworking has a great tutorial on how to do the 5-cut method with all the complex math. I'm not going to be doing the complex math today. I'm going to show you what I'm doing here in just a second. After you make your 4 cuts around, we're going to come back to the AB side and cut about a 1/2 inch off. If you want to skip all the complex math, do what I did. Google 5-cut method calculator and select the KM Tools 5-cut method calculator. Actually, you know what? I left you a link in the description. Go down there and click on it, and click the subscribe button on your way down there. We need to get our measurements we're going to put into the calculator. We're going to start with the A end of your cutoff and measure the width with a pair of digital calipers. I got 6/10 of an inch. We find the A side in the calculator and put it there. Then we measure the B side of the cutoff, and I got 563 1/1000ths of an inch. Since my digital calipers aren't wide enough to measure the length of the cutoff, I have to use my regular tape measure. Now I get 13 and almost 11/16, so we're going to call it 13 and 21/32. I'm going to use Microsoft Excel to convert that for me, and that gives me 13.66 of an inch. Doing the same thing, I measured the length from my pivot screw in my fence to the other end of my fence, and that gave me 41 and 11/16, or 41 and 69 100ths. And we put that in the calculator as well. We hit the calculate button, and it's going to tell me that my fence is 28 1/1000ths of an inch off, and it needs to move in. I'm going to take a feeler gauge and place it against my fence, and then clamp a board in place against that feeler gauge so that when I remove the feeler gauge, I'll have a 28 1/1000ths of an inch gap. Now I'm going to remove the screw from this end of the fence and move the fence inward till it's pressed against the board that I have clamped in place. Then I'm going to put a clamp on the fence, drill a new screw hole. That's important. You don't want to go back into the old screw hole because it'll just pull the fence back. And then I'll insert a new screw. Sorry for the shot, but it is just screwing and unscrewing. With my fence repositioned, I do the 5-cut method again. If you do it right, you normally only have to do this once or twice. Taking my new cut off, I measure side A, which I get 551 1/1000ths. Side B, I get 551 thousandths, which tells me I'm really close already. So I'll put those numbers in the calculator. I hit calculate and find out my fence is only 1/1000th of an inch out of square. I think that's pretty good. I'll take it. Now that my fence is all squared up, I can finish securing it to the sled base. I'll pre-drill a few holes and add some screws in, making sure not to screw through my hardware such as T-track or the aluminum tubing that I almost messed up earlier in the video. Then I'll attach the end cap of my fence, secure it with the headless bolts, and give it a test run. Nice. I'm gonna make the kerf cut through my fence, and I'm gonna take this slow because not only am I cutting through the aluminum multi-track, I'm also cutting through the aluminum tubing on the inside, and that is a lot of aluminum to cut through. If you jam the fence across here, it's probably going to break something, so I took it slow. Using a metal file, I knock off the burrs and create a slight bevel on the aluminum tubing where I just cut it, then I reinsert it back into the fence. Put the end piece on the fence and secure it with the headless bolt. Oh, wrong hole. That's better. So I secure it with the headless bolt and give it a test run. Now the other side of the fence is working. So I add in my thumb screws to secure it in place. To make the multi-track go the full length of the fence, I'm going to grab another piece of multi-track and cut 2 6-inch pieces off. I'm going to take a metal file, knock the burrs off, and make some bevels on the back and bottom so when it comes across the fence, it slides on nicely. Right there, that's where we want to do the bevels. Then I'll slide it over the T-bolts and tighten everything down. Now the T-bolt in the main fence is just a guide, so don't make that super tight. It needs to be able to slide on and off of that T-bolt easily. I did use a screw to lock this piece in place on this fence extension. And then repeated the process on the other side of the fence. Having adjustable kerfs in the sled means I also need to be able to change the kerf in the fence. In order to achieve this, I'm going to create a window in the fence for an insert. I'm not going to cut out the whole thing with my table saw. I need to make just enough room to get a blade of my jigsaw in there, and then I'm going to finish it off with the jigsaw and smooth everything out with my metal file. My fence is done. Well, almost. I need to make the inserts. I'm going to do that by cutting down this poplar board that I had left over from another project. Once I cut a few of those out, I move my attention to the adjustable kerfs on the inside of the fence. I need to make holes for the bolts to go through that are going to hold these down to the fence. In order to do that, I'm going to employ my router sled again. I'll take and set my router depth to the head of the screw using the 3/4 inch router bit that I have and make some grooves. That's going to look a little bit like this. Leaving my sled set up, I change the bit out to a 1/4 inch bit and finish the cut through. This will give me a hole that will have a recess for the head of the bolt and let the rest of the bolt go all the way through like this. The material I'm using for my adjustable kerfs is some laminate flooring I had from a previous project. I just simply cut it into the size I needed and made these holes for the screws. This stuff is pretty tough, and I like the little added flair of the wood grain in the sled. Now I take the bolts and secure the adjustable kerf into the sled. I start by cutting the 45. And you can see in the fence there is a new kerf block. After I make that 45 cut, I remove the excess, change out to the dado blade, and put a fresh kerf block into my fence. So now I have a 45, a 90, and a dado block that I can change out. Then I made the back fence pretty by making a window for the blades. To secure the interchangeable kerf blocks, I'm going to need to put screws through the fence, and that's what I'm pre-drilling these holes for. But before I do that, I'm going to add a safety block on the back to prevent the blade from becoming exposed as I use the table saw sled. Once that's secure, I'm going to use a Forstner bit to drill an inset to take some guitar neck bushings. These are normally used to hold the screws where the guitar neck connects to the body. I'm going to use them where the kerf inserts connect to the fence. Since these screws will be removed and placed back in as I change out my inserts, that constant motion would cause this hole to waller out, and these inserts will prevent that. Then I'm going to take this drill bit and drill all the way through to make sure that it's nice and smooth for that screw to go through. Now this drill bit is slightly larger than my screw because I don't want the screw to grab the fence, I only want it to grab the insert. These are pretty big screws. I think they're number 10s, but they're 4 inches long. As you can see, they just slide right through the fence, and that guitar neck bushing keeps it from going any farther. Now I need to pre-drill the holes in the inserts. The easiest way I found to do that was to put the insert in and give the screws a light tap to mark the insert so I could pre-drill them. Once they're pre-drilled, I put the insert in, screw the screws in, securing it. I think I need a way to measure what I'm cutting. I do. I picked up this FastCap measuring tape. The thing I like about it is it comes with its own double stick tape, and this is some serious double-sided tape. It also measures from both left and right. One side measures left, the other side measures right. Comes in handy in a project like this because the tape is 16 feet long. I'll need 16 feet, so I can apply one side measuring from left to right and the other side measuring from right to left. It also has both metric and imperial measurements, which makes it easy if I decide to use metric for some reason. And it's not a paper tape or plastic or vinyl. It is an actual metal tape just like you find in their retractable tape measures. So I expect the durability would be similar. With the last few touches going into place, to remind myself not to put my hand here while I'm running the saw. Yes, I know better, but having a reminder of what my fingers will look like if I don't remember might save them one day. All right, I promised a couple of additional jigs for the end of the video, and I'm gonna show those to you here. One is this. It is a support piece for your work pieces. That way, if you just extend your fence, if you need a little bit of extra support to hold your work piece up, you slide this on and lock it into place with the star knobs, and then it gives your workpiece a little something to sit on to support it. The laminate for this whole thing is actually white marker board from Formica. I can take a dry erase marker and I can make notes such as the size of the cuts I need to make. And voila. I saw this jig on King's Fine Woodworking's video and I had to have it. This is a miter jig for the Crosscut Sled. It's just a digital protractor with a few pieces of wood, and you just make sure everything's square. If you want to see how to build that, you can go check that out on their video. Now that I have it in here, I can just loosen it up, adjust this fence to wherever I need it, lock it in place, make my cut, and it's pretty dang accurate. I like it. I like it a lot. If you want to build this for yourself, go check out the description. On your way down there, give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. In the description, I have left links for the plans to this Crosscut Sled, tools you may need, and all the hardware you're gonna need for this. If you haven't watched my video of all the Crosscut Sleds that inspired this one, it's right here. If you've already watched it, give this one a try.